When America went to war, New York City was the gateway to battle. Did you know that German saboteurs blew up tons of ammunition right next to the Statue of Liberty? The explosion of Black Tom Island was larger than 9/11.
To this day, Black Tom is considered the biggest act of sabotage to have occurred on American soil. Hundreds and hundreds of windows were just blown out in Manhattan.
The police really have no idea what the death toll was because at the time, there were people living in ships all throughout New York Harbor. And many of those ships just disintegrated. You know, they were literally turned to dust.
And when Abraham Lincoln needed more men to fight the Civil War, he authorized the first federal draft law. New York City went up in flames.
People start throwing these stones, rocks, bricks at the police that are guarding the draft officers, and as you can imagine, all hell breaks loose. Everywhere you looked, there were buildings on fire, and you could see policemen running away from mobs.
What made those 4 days the worst riots in American history? Why did more Americans die in New York City than on the battlefields of the Revolutionary War? And how did German spies manage to set off an explosion big enough to rock the Brooklyn Bridge? Find out as I uncover the wartime secrets of New York. It was 1916, and while World War I was already raging in Europe, America was still neutral. A British naval blockade in the Atlantic kept scores of German ships trapped in New York Harbor.
German ships tried to run the British blockade. Some made it through, some did not. So a lot of the captains kept their ships out of harm's way in ports such as New York.
Even if a German ship wanted to leave New York Harbor, U.S. authorities wouldn't allow it. At the same time, tons of U.S. ammunition and war supplies were being shipped out of the city to France and Great Britain, and those explosives were bound for the war against Germany.
There was this stewing animosity for the United States and the hypocritical stance that the Germans felt they were taking, and so their best solution to all this was to blow up as many munitions depots as possible, because that's what ended up harming them the most when they got back to the front.
There was only one way the Germans could stop the flow of ammunition to the Allies: sabotage. A promising candidate emerged. A German naval intelligence officer arrived in New York City under a false passport. His real name was Franz von Rintelen. His job? Running a spy ring.
Franz von Rintelen decided he was going to infiltrate as many munitions depots as he could. And the comment he had before he left Germany that he gave to his superiors was, "I'm going to buy up what I can, and I'm going to blow up what I can't."
While much of the German spy network operated out of embassies in New York and Washington, von Rintelen worked locally, and with the help of a German scientist in Brooklyn, he perfected a deadly little firebomb the size of a cigar.
It was a lead pipe about the size of a cigar, hence the name cigar bomb, that they would put a piece of copper in the middle of. And then on either side of the copper, they would put two corrosives. When they would eat through the copper, they would ignite and start a fire.
And so what the Germans did was they planted these little cigar bombs on ships, and they were designed to explode when they were at sea. The thickness of the copper is what determined how long before the ship was out at sea and actually caught fire. There was nothing anyone could do about it.
The cigar bombs were being made right under the nose of U.S. intelligence. There were secret bomb factories on board German ships at the city's docks. But Franz von Rintelen wanted a bigger prize: the huge munitions depot in the middle of New York Harbor. Black Tom Island jutted out into the water just off the New Jersey mainland. Trainloads of war material arrived from as far west as Ohio.
There were tons and tons, hundreds of tons of munitions being transferred. They would come in on the train, be unloaded, with the next tide be loaded onto waiting barges and then the waiting ships to be taken overseas. It was a target that would have been the prize of any espionage ring, even in today's standards.
Franz von Rintelen started casing out specifically Black Tom. And he walked the docks and sort of made a map of what it looked like and decided this was going to be his big target. But what happened was the U.S. authorities were already onto him.
Von Rintelen fled New York for London, but federal agents had followed him. He was arrested when he arrived and spent the rest of World War I in an English prison. But von Rintelen had left a team of saboteurs back in New York City, and on the night of July 30th, 1916, the operation went forward without him.
They waited till darkest part of the night when security was at its lowest, that they picked the perfect day. There was a barge sitting there with tons of TNT, which had not gone out at the last of the tide for the evening, so it stayed there, which was against policy. There were also freight cars that were loaded with TNT and nitroglycerin and dynamite and ammunition.
There were two men who had rowboats, German spies, who were in rowboats on the New York side of the harbor, and they were equipped with these cigar bombs. On the other side, right across from Black Tom Island, which was full of train yards and factories, was another man, and the idea was, let's get him working there so he's familiar to the security staff at Black Tom Island. And when he came on the night of the explosion, the security guards who recognized him didn't think twice when they saw him walking around.
The German agent who slipped by security guards entered the weapons depot to my left and planted what were probably cigar bombs into the boxcars that were loaded with explosives. Then he escaped back through the rail yard. At the same time, two men in rowboats entered the depot from the harbor side and planted more bombs on floating barges and train cars. They rowed back out across the harbor. I'm standing on a secret of New York that's now a part of Liberty State Park in New Jersey. In 1916, it was a small island filled with enough explosives to blow up a town. 20 minutes after the German agents left, just after 2 a.m., this entire place was on fire.
Unfortunately, before they can get any of these fires under control, it was too late. The explosion was loud enough to be heard, according to reports, as far away as Baltimore and Connecticut.
What the saboteurs blew up was the largest munitions depot in the country. So that included everything from bullets, detonators, it was sticks of dynamite. It was basically a year's worth of ammunition that was being sent to the British and the French was blowing up in a span of 2 hours. It was an explosion that was so vast, it was a 6-point and higher on the Richter scale. The Brooklyn Bridge was just swaying back and forth.
You can still see the remains of the train tracks of Black Tom's rail yard at Liberty State Park. Most of the depot had been devastated by the blast. The Statue of Liberty had a big piece of shrapnel in her arm. Pieces of metal and glass covered lower Manhattan. But because the explosion took place between 2 and 4 in the morning, the death toll was surprisingly low, which is exactly what the Germans had in mind.
The attack was designed to minimize the number of casualties. The level of shock after it happened was actually not as high as you would think, because there was still an idea that this was an accident at a private railroad. And when the New York Times reported about the explosion, there were no reports of it being a blatant attack by the German government.
The Germans always planned to keep their activity a secret for as long as they possibly could. The idea was keep the Americans friendly or at least neutral towards the Germans. They could not afford to have them enter the war.
Less than a year after the attack, the U.S. did enter World War I, but no one listed Black Tom as one of the causes. The men who planted the bombs were never caught, and it took decades for the Germans to finally admit what they had done. As terrible as that explosion was, it wasn't the worst violence in the city's history. Half a century before Black Tom Island, in 1863, New York City was in turmoil. Its population was doubling every 20 years, and America was divided by the Civil War being fought over slavery.
There was increasingly a gap between people that owned businesses, owned factories, were involved in the booming part of the economy, and the new cheap labor that was arriving by the boatload to fuel the economic growth.
Most of the people right off the boat were poor and Irish, living in filthy tenements and working for low wages. 1863 saw not only a series of labor strikes in the city for better pay, but the ending of slavery by President Abraham Lincoln. A few weeks later, New York City police brought in freed African Americans as strikebreakers.
Earlier that year, the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued. All these things are adding up to a combination of racism and economic fear that we're feeding each other.
The fear was that this was just going to produce more competition for the people who couldn't make it already. It wouldn't hurt the people who were on top, the people who were established. It would hurt the people who were looking for work.
By July of 1863, New York faced more pressure from Washington. The Union Army needed 500,000 men to keep fighting the Civil War. All over the city, people gathered for the results of the first federal draft lottery in American history.
And they start drawing names. The entire community is turned out because people are waiting to see if their name's going to be drawn, if their brother's name is going to be drawn, if their buddy's name is going to be drawn, and each name produces a pocket of discontent. By the end of that first day, they'd drawn a little over 1,200 names. So they said, that's enough for today. Everybody go home and come back on Monday and we'll draw the rest.
Waiting to finish the draft lottery was a crucial mistake. The delay left the rest of that July weekend for anger to spread in saloons, on street corners, and much of that anger focused on one important loophole. If you had $300, you could buy a substitute to fight for you.
$300. If you look at it compared to a typical unskilled worker's wage, it's more the equivalent of about $50,000 today. None of these people had $300 to buy their way out of it, so they were very much aware that this was poor laborers being drafted to fight a war, and some of them weren't even sure that they believed that the war was worth fighting.
On Monday morning, July 13th, 1863, hundreds of people were marching down 2nd and 3rd Avenues towards the federal draft offices. They were tearing down telegraph wires so the police couldn't call for help. By noon on Monday, a mob had attacked government workers and set fire to one of the draft offices at 46th Street and 2nd Avenue. John Kennedy, New York City's police superintendent, left headquarters to inspect the damage. He never made it to the scene of the crime.
Somebody recognizes him through the window of his carriage. They swarm the carriage. They beat him to the point where he's hospitalized. They take his driver, they drag him out of the carriage, they drag him through the streets, beat him, break his bones, bash his skull in. And this is the kind of hatred directed at the police.
Throughout that first day, violent mobs formed in various parts of the city. Most of the federal militia was fighting the Battle of Gettysburg and weren't around to back up the police, who were badly outnumbered. There was no centralized fire department in 1863, and some of the volunteer fire companies actually joined the rioters, angry that the new law did not exempt them from being drafted. The situation began to spiral out of control.
By the end of the day, there are numerous buildings on fire or burned. The mobs have attacked both draft offices, police stations. There are crews of so-called longshoremen's associations that are patrolling the waterfront looking for any black man they could find to hang him, throw him in the river, beat him to death. All those things happened.
African Americans were the victims of the worst violence. An orphan asylum with over 200 African American children was attacked by a mob who tried to burn it down with the children inside. They escaped out a back door just in time. Anyone who sympathized with African Americans was attacked, especially those who were part of the abolitionist movement to stop slavery.
Horace Greeley, best-known abolitionist newspaper man, they attacked his home and also the offices of his newspaper. The New York Times was attacked, but the New York Times secured 2 Gatling guns, early machine guns, and had set them up in the lobby of their office building.
This block on West 29th Street has one of the secrets of New York, the home of James and Abigail Gibbons, who were so dedicated to ending slavery that their home was a stop on the famous Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad was an unofficial and secret network of people helping runaway slaves who were running away for their lives. And people like the Gibbonses that provided shelter and money to these slaves, you know, they were doing something illegal. And so this had to be kept secret.
Did that make other New Yorkers angry at them?
People did not realize, I think, that it was an Underground Railroad station, but they did know that the Gibbonses were abolitionists, and they were angry about that because they thought that if blacks were emancipated, if they were freed, then they were going to take their jobs.
When the draft riots struck, the Gibbons got word that their house would be attacked. The two Gibbons daughters fled to their aunt's house a few doors away.
The mob had begun surging down 8th Avenue and then down 29th Street. Men started immediately by breaking open the windows of the Gibbons house with pickaxes. The girls saw this from their aunt's house. They saw smoke emerge from their house at 339. That's because people had set their house on fire. They were holding torches and they poured turpentine onto the Gibbons' furniture.
Was it a possibility that the Gibbons family could have lost their lives that day?
Oh, definitely. In fact, they had to go. Their only choice was to go on the rooftops. And at that time, all the rooftops were level. So that is how they were able to go across all of them to the very last house on the block, which is now 303 West 29th Street.
303 West 29th Street still stands, and from its roof, you can actually follow the path the Gibbons family took to save their lives. This, Fern, is where the Gibbons family would have made their exit off these roofs.
Yes, they were coming from their aunt's house all the way down the block, and they traveled over all these roofs and running for their lives. Remember, there were hundreds and hundreds of people, angry people in that mob down below on the streets. And their only way to safety was to go over these roofs. Their friend had prearranged to have a carriage ready for them on the street, and that is how they made their final getaway.
The family did escape the mob that day and eventually moved back into their home, which had not completely burned down. Others in the city were not so lucky. By the fourth day of the riots, when federal troops restored order, hundreds of people had been killed, scores of buildings destroyed. The African-American population did not fully recover for decades.
These New York City draft riots during the Civil War were the worst riots in American history. We often think of the racial unrest of the 1960s as producing the biggest riots, but the New York City draft riots, over 100 dead, maybe 150, 200 dead, something like $50 billion worth of damage from a riot in today's dollars. This was an enormous riot in terms of property damage and in terms of human life.
You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party, but here's a secret for you. New York City had a tea party of its own 4 months later in April of 1773. Patriots boarded a British ship and threw the tea into New York Harbor. It all led up to the moment when America declared itself a free country. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud on the streets of New York as General George Washington and his troops looked on. The British reaction was brutal and massive.
General Howe, in the summer of 1776, brought into New York a force of somewhere around 30 to 40,000 men altogether. It was a huge operation. Something like half of the men and ships in the British Army and Navy were parked right off of Staten Island in the summer of 1776. It was a show of force. It was shock and awe, to use a modern expression.
The British used boats to land this gigantic force on the shores of Brooklyn to make an end run around the American troops. Washington found himself outflanked and trapped in Brooklyn Heights by a much larger army. The revolution was almost over before it began.
He almost lost, and if he had lost the Battle of Long Island, the revolution would be over. No army, no revolution. It's as simple as that. Fortunately for the revolution, Washington, a couple of days later, snuck out from Brooklyn Heights across to Manhattan with what remained of his army and kept the revolution going, but it was a very close call.
New York City was British military headquarters until the Revolutionary War ended 8 years later, one of the longest wars in American history. Every soldier captured in battle was brought back to the city to be imprisoned.
The British didn't build stockades or prisons to hold their prisoners. What they did was to squeeze them into any available building that they could find, and that meant some taverns, some sugar houses, which were the biggest structures in the 18th century city. Anything that was of any size was very quickly filled up with American prisoners.
This is a window from one of the city's old sugar houses. They were massive stone structures that held equipment to distill molasses into rum. Hundreds of prisoners were shut inside in a living nightmare.
A typical sugar house might have 800 to 900 to 1,000 prisoners stuffed in at a time. This, remember, is without any kind of sanitary facilities or provisions for recreation or anything of the sort. Prisoners were very badly fed, and what they were fed was almost inedible. It was a horrible experience, and my guess is that probably 60% to 70% of the men died.
There were no trials, no legal rights, no appeals. The only way out was death or becoming a traitor and joining the British Army.
The British viewed them as rebels and traitors rather than as lawful combatants. So what you do with a rebel or a traitor is you hang them. And if you're not going to hang them, then you stuff them in some place like a sugar house or the jail, and you just let them rot.
So many prisoners were brought to New York City as the war dragged on that the British ran out of space. They began to use old, broken-down ships as prison hulks, anchored mostly in Wallabout Bay, the site of today's Brooklyn Navy Yard.
If you were to stand in Lower Manhattan and look across to Wallabout Bay, you would have seen 6 or 8 of these prison ships at a time. And if the wind was right, you probably would have smelled them as well. So it must have been a terrifying sight.
Edwin Burroughs titled his book about these American prisoners of war forgotten patriots because their sacrifice has faded from memory. It took over a century for Congress to create the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument here in Fort Greene Park, Brooklyn. It's still the largest Revolutionary War memorial in the country.
This is the crypt where all the bones that were collected by the Tammany Society from the shores of Wallabout Bay off in the distance were brought here. Nobody knows how many bodies that represents. It's only a small proportion, probably, of the total number of men who lost their lives, around 12,000 people.
What did the British ships look like?
They began using broken down warships, hospital ships, transport ships to house American prisoners. The biggest one, the Jersey, was about 150 feet long, which is roughly half the size of a football field.
And the conditions of the ships where the prisoners stayed?
Awful. Indescribable conditions. It was said often by survivors that the air was so foul that they couldn't keep a candle lit, and you can imagine what that was like.
In terms of ventilation, exercise, anything like that, there was none of that?
No ventilation, no exercise, no fresh water, no opportunity to go above decks. I mean, there were what were called politely necessary tubs in the ships. They were always overflowing, and they had to be brought up every day and dumped overboard and so forth. I mean, it's not surprising that these prisoners routinely came down with typhus and dysentery and smallpox, and they died literally by the thousands. What happened to them after the war? The answer is they disappeared. They walked off into the sunset, into the mists of history. For years in the 19th century, Brooklynites would go down to Wallabout Bay to picnic and collect the bones of Revolutionary War prisoners. One man said the skulls were lying on the beach as thick as pumpkins in an autumn field. And they collected all of these things, and eventually they wound up in this crypt that was underneath the Prison Ship Martyrs Memorial. The best guess is that around 6,800 Americans died in battle in the Revolutionary War. But I think that in the prisons and prison ships of New York, that somewhere around 18,000 men perished. In other words, more than twice as many died in the prisons and prison ships of New York as died on the battlefield. New York City is the graveyard of the revolution, and nobody knows that.
Until the day the British finally evacuated New York City in November of 1783, they didn't realize that their mistreatment of American prisoners had inflamed the colonies against them and helped defeat their army. The patriots who survived the British prisons helped form a new nation. New York City overcame the horrors of British occupation and overtook London as an industrial powerhouse. Everywhere you turn in this great and mysterious city, there are secrets to be found. All you have to do is look for them. Manhattan we walk today has a different shape than the place the Dutch called New Amsterdam.